So this talk really kind of spawned just because there was some questions from different groups that participate in restoration actions and activities as to what ODFW is kind of looking for and the status of steelhead currently right now. As all of you know, since 2016, we've had some major dips in the wild A index run over Bonneville. At times in as early as 2010, 2011, we were seeing upwards of 100,000 plus wild A fish going over Bonneville. And, since 2016, it's been in the mid 30,000 range, and the last couple of years in the 20,000s. And the TAC forecast for 2023, unfortunately, is 17,300. So we're in a negative downward decline. And so we wanted to discuss what ODFW would like to see in terms of restoration actions that we feel would have the most uplift for fish. Next slide, please, Ian. So this is all kind of spawning from current climatic conditions, the drought, the heat wave, continued poor ocean conditions for steelhead. These are all things that we've seen continually decline and has led to some pretty precipitous drops in the wild A numbers. So in the 90s through 2013, there was a large focus on push-up dam removals, converting them to lay flats, a lot of culverts and bridges put in and replaced. So passage was definitely a very high priority for the basin for many, many years. And, as an example, in the John Day Watershed Strategy report from 97 to 2013, there were 150 passage problems addressed. Meanwhile, during that same time frame, only 27 in-stream habitat projects. So, we all know that replacing culverts or infrastructure is a lot easier to get permitted. There's a lot of funding for it, and that's great. Everyone in this basin that has done these actions have made huge gains in terms of passage for fish. So that was a really big focus, and there was a lot of work done to it and to a high degree of effect. Next slide, please. Then, around 2013, 2015, constructed riffles were used in place of lay flat diversions. And basically through 2010, 2018, I recall that time frame as being pretty heavily focused on replacing culverts and doing strictly passage type projects, or there was a lot of passage type projects done. And again, that just speaks to how effective it is, because we're now in a situation where it's a lot more challenging to find passage projects that people are willing to address. There's some really complicated ones involving multiple water users and landowners. And we're still working on passage. There's some good ones still out there. But just as a general overview, a lot of culverts these days just aren't meeting the muster of where we need to focus our restoration efforts because of the lack of juveniles and habitat that's lacking for juvenile survival, which Ian will talk to a little bit later. Next slide, please. And, from 2016 on to today, we really want to target restoration actions that will improve productivity of our juveniles. What we're seeing a lot, and what Ian's going to talk about, is just the fact that while we have a decrease in the amount of escapement or our adults returning to spawn, that number has gone down. But what we're also seeing is a drop in juveniles outmigrating out of the John Day Basin. So that's kind of a double factor, a double negative whammy, I guess you could call it, for our steelhead, the populations in the John Day. So while we can't, make the ocean perfect for steelhead, we don't have a means to address the ocean conditions. There's certainly, we feel, opportunity to increase survival of juvenile rearing capacity in the John Day Basin in the freshwater. And that's where we kind of want to focus our attention now. Next slide, I believe. Oh, and just, it may seem that some people may feel like this is like an all of a sudden about face on passage. It's not, but it's hard to deny that in 2021, when we really got that drought of record, 22 still wasn't good enough to recover anything. We were losing miles of tributary habitat to low flows, high temperatures, no flows, disconnected passage due to no water available. And we had the tie for the all-time record temperature in June, which is very early to have those kind of temperatures. In 22, we did not see any real recovery because we're in a continued drought. I mean, the 2000 to 2020 has been the driest historic time frame in Oregon history. So really, if we're going to benefit steelhead in any really fashion in the John Day, a high priority needs to be focused on letting those juveniles have water and habitat suitable for rearing. The more that they leave, the more juveniles leaving the system, I mean, they're going to be faced with poor ocean conditions, but that still hedges our bets in terms of trying to increase productivity in the basin. Next slide, please. And, you know, ODFW in general has kind of gravitated towards this message as well. In 2022, Adrienne's going to talk about this, but they formed a beaver habitat action plan for advancing the landscape scale of beaver habitat in Oregon, which we feel would benefit our riparian areas. And, you know, we have just so many miles of degraded streams and with very little habitat, very little water. There's just a whole lot of rocky, over-widened and incised channels in the John Day Basin. And when Ian starts talking about where we're seeing juveniles, they're not using that habitat. They're using suitable habitat. And so we need to really focus on increasing the amount of suitable habitat available for them. OWEB has this climate resolution that they adopted in 2022 to fund resiliency for watersheds and natural resources. And this also ties into a mutually beneficial suite of actions that we feel would also benefit landowners and irrigators, you know, increasing your wet meadow productivity, as well as your hyporheic exchanges and your groundwater capacity. I mean, these are all things that we know without turning on a rain gauge somehow and giving us 40 inches of rain this summer in John Day. The only real means of doing that, of increasing the latency of water and not having it dissipate as early as July, really is focusing on improving our riparian habitats, as well as increasing our hyporheic exchanges and our groundwater exchange. And in addition to all that, ODFW did resurrect the habitat division, which existed in the past and then kind of fell apart due to funding. And now we are very much focused on habitat throughout the state of Oregon, not just for fish, but wildlife as well. And so that's a pretty exciting new endeavor that ODFW is undertaking. Next slide, I believe the next one is Ian's talk now. So I'll mute myself.
Okay, thanks, Steph. Yeah, I'm Ian Tattam with Oregon Fish and Wildlife Fish Research. I'm going to take on some of the spring Chinook and summer steelhead population status and trends info, and then talk a little bit too about where the data that we have that can help parameterize some of the things that Steph talked about and help us focus on creating habitat projects in the areas that we think will do the most benefit for fish in the near term. Okay, so I'm going to go through natural origin spawner abundance for Chinook first, and then for steelhead. So John Day Basin has 3 identified populations of spring Chinook. There's the Middle Fork population, the North Fork population, and the Upper John Day population. And here's our estimate of spawner abundance from about 2000 through 2022. And you can see that, you know, there is some evidence of a cyclical nature for abundance in these populations, but while they are cycling up and down, the general trend line, if you were to start around 2000, is down for most of these populations, especially the Middle Fork. There's been a decline in adult abundance in the recent 5 years or so. North Fork shows that trend as well. Kind of counter to that trend, the upper main stem has been cyclical, but a little bit more stable through time. And, you know, we hypothesize that that's because the presence of water and suitable summer rearing conditions are really the greatest there on the landscape right now. So that's sort of, you know, part of the basis for our hypothesis that we really need to focus on freshwater rearing conditions. That's one of the driving factors that we can control for these fish. So then when we look at replacement of John Day spring Chinook, and this is adult to adult replacement. So this is number of spawner recruits that we get per number of total spawners. The yellow line here represents one. So that's where if you have one spawner in the basin in 2000, let's say, then in 2004, you get one spawner back. And so this is sort of a metric to see how the population cycles through time. And again, you can see a period of low recruitment early in the 2000s, and then, fairly high recruitment in the mid 2000s, and then again, declining recruitment in the more recent years. So again, things are cyclical through time, but I think what's concerning to us is some of these really low productivity years in the brood year 2013 in the North Fork, and also brood years 2013 and 2014 in the Middle Fork. Those were years of poor freshwater conditions, drought years, and the Chinook populations really fared pretty poorly in those years. And those are the kind of conditions that we're trying, to the extent possible, we're trying to guard against or avoid in the future by, habitat actions that can change the hydrology or presence of water and suitable habitat on the landscape. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears over to summer steelhead now. And John Day Basin we've managed for 5 populations of summer steelhead: the upper main stem, the Middle Fork John Day, the North Fork John Day, the South Fork John Day, and the lower main stem. The John Day lower main stem is defined as from the confluence of the South Fork downstream all the way to the Columbia. And again, the majority of these steelhead are spawning in tributary streams. So there's some spawning in the South Fork proper and the Middle Fork proper, but really the majority of spawning, based on our data, is occurring in the tributaries to those, to the South Fork and the Middle Fork, and especially the tributaries to the main stem and the North Fork. So really, these fish are really sensitive to changes in flow and temperature in tributary streams. And that's something that, we feel like we can focus our habitat action efforts on and potentially create changes there. So yellow line here, orange line here in these figures is the minimum abundance threshold identified by the ESA recovery plans for these species in these populations. And just at a broad brush, you can see that the majority, we were generally exceeding those minimum thresholds in the 2010 to 2015 era. But as Steph mentioned, these populations have made a substantial decline since the 2015 era. And while a lot of that is driven by poor smolt to adult survival or poor survival in the combination of the Columbia and the ocean, which we suspect is happening mainly in the ocean, there's also an influence of freshwater conditions, which have been noticeably worse, especially in the last 2 to 3 years. So targeting those freshwater conditions is a strategy that we can use to try to return to a higher abundance state here. So shifting over to productivity, again, we're looking at, the concept here. The orange line is 1 adult recruit per spawner. And again, you can see that, the productivity of these populations was really fairly high in the mid 2000s, but it's declined pretty substantially in the recent years. And again, we think that's a combination of freshwater and ocean, but freshwater is the area we can focus on. So trying to provide more habitat in freshwater is really the best strategy we have for steelhead management right now. So I'm going to shift over here to a little schematic, and I want to just show briefly the strategy in terms of a monitoring approach that we've used to try to wrap our heads around what's going on in freshwater and tease apart the freshwater effect from the ocean effect. So the left 2 panels here of this figure are, to start with, the number of reds. This is Chinook reds here. So here's just a line plot through time of number of reds. And then the bottom panel is estimated smolts at John Day Dam. So we're estimating the number of adults coming into the basin, and then subsequently, 1 to 3 or 4 years later, when the smolts go out of the basin, we're estimating the number that go out. And then we use those 2 data streams here combine to estimate the number, the natural log of smolts per red, regress that against reds. And you expect to see this natural declining function here. As the number of reds increases, you're going to produce fewer smolts per red. That's just the natural habitat capacity. We're trying to lift this whole line up and improve the habitat capacity by, we'd see that result in terms of this line lifting up. But we can also in the short term take a look at the residual values here noted by this double red arrow, which is the distance between the predicted value and the observed value. And then we can plot those predicted versus observed values through time here in this bottom. And so this sort of gives us a metric of how freshwater productivity is trending either through time or with changes in freshwater habitat conditions that removes the effect of the ocean survival and the number of fish coming back into the basin. So this is sort of our monitoring and research approach to doing this, on the population scale of tracking results through time. And I just want to give one snippet here for Middle Fork Spring Chinook, where we did that stock recruit relationship that I mentioned just now, and then we plotted out the residual values through time. And you can see that, here we're starting with the 2003 summer of freshwater rearing in 2003 and going all the way up through 2020. So we missed the really bad year that Steph mentioned, right? 2021, because those data are still trickling in as those fish leave the system. But Middle Fork Spring Chinook here, to me, what this graph represents is that productivity through time in the Middle Fork for Spring Chinook has been relatively stable. There's not a long-term trend here. And I think one of the things driving this is the Middle Fork is an area where we've done a lot of in-stream habitat work, right? We've done the Oxbow project, Dunstan projects, and many other actual in-stream habitat projects. And Steph and Kelly gave a really great presentation about temperature trends in the Middle Fork at one of our prior group meetings. And, while air temperatures have gone up, precipitation has gone down, stream temperature has stayed relatively stable. I think that's one of the things that's potentially driving what we see here, is all that freshwater habitat restoration is, while we're not, we'd like to see these residual values trending up, right? Because that's how we're going to produce more juveniles out of freshwater, is have these values trend up. At least here they're level and not declining. And I think a reasonable hypothesis here is that the amount of freshwater habitat work in the Middle Fork has contributed to stability of freshwater productivity through time in the Middle Fork. And this is something we would like to see that's expanded to other areas of the more focused on habitat work throughout the entire basin. So that was sort of the population scale, right? The really high level view of looking at these populations like the entire Middle Fork. But then, that's not perfect guidance or really useful guidance for how you get down and actually do the work on the ground. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the data we have for site level fish abundance and how we think that could be helpful for optimizing restoration effort. And so really the base level here is we want to identify streams where low and high abundance exists. And while we also want to make sure we're protecting the areas of high abundance, a lot of that's already been done. So we want to really focus on restoring the areas of low abundance, which is kind of the concept I'm going to get into of, you can see a big shift from low abundance to medium or low to medium to high and make those gains in productivity. Okay, so these dots across the John Day Basin here represent the density of juvenile steelhead / omicus that we've sampled in the summer or end of summer. Black dots are 0, no fish present or no steelhead present. Red is low, yellow is sort of a medium, a basin-wide mean value. Green are really good sites of high abundance. And so, as you look across the landscape here, you can kind of use this as a rough gauge of, okay, where are juvenile steelhead? And then we're going to zoom into a couple of examples right here. We're going to zoom into 30-mile creek here, tributary to the lower main stem John Day. And, here we see the yellow and green dots here. This is a pretty good area of 30-mile where productivity and juvenile density is fairly high. So that's an area where you want to focus on restoration to maximize benefit there. And then you also see some of these red areas up here where, currently there's not a lot of fish or no fish, but those are potentially areas where we can go from, this red is low abundance, right? So black dot is no abundance, red is low, and you can see, pretty clear reason for why you're seeing that difference. And so by going from, doing habitat work in these areas of low abundance, we're hoping to be able to shift those into the yellow and green categories through time. And one restoration tool in the toolbox here that's being applied in 30-mile creek is large-scale application of beaver dam analog. So here's an area of upper 30-mile. Again, you can see really currently relatively poor riparian, poor connectivity to the floodplain here, really narrow green zone here. But Gillum Soil and Water District and others are, really aggressively applying beaver dam analogs in here to try to create the habitat, which can then shift us from the red zone here. So we know there are fish here, we know there are juvenile steelhead here. So we've got our base population, but we just want to move them up into the yellow and green zone. And this is one strategy to do that right now. So again, another zoom in here on this map. We're going to zoom into the upper Middle Fork here. So here's the very headwaters of the Middle Fork. And kind of in contrast here, we have these reds and yellows down here in the main stem, Middle Fork, and some of the tributaries. But we have a lot of black up here in the headwater streams. And so this is an area where, we would hope to lean away from passage or habitat projects up here and lean more into habitat projects in these red and yellow areas, because we know fish are there. They're there so they can begin to benefit from actions immediately. Whereas up here, there's potentially other drivers like stream desiccation or just, simple, lack of stream size or catchment area there in these black areas that, will really attenuate or create a long time potentially to see benefits from a restoration action. So shifting over a little bit into how temperature affects this. These figures on the bottom here are for Chinook on the left and steelhead on the right. And these are data that the Middle Fork IMW project has collected. So you have 7-day average daily temperature in the summertime on the x-axis, and then proportion of sites with Chinook here on the y, proportion of sites with steelhead on the y in this right-hand panel. So you can see that, at these cooler sites where the 7-day average temperature is below about 18 for Chinook, they're pretty broadly distributed across the landscape, but you have a very precipitous decline here as you go from 18 to 21 for Chinook, and then a similar, little bit more attenuated decline for steelhead, but similar concept as you go from about 20 to 24, 23, you have a pretty precipitous decline. So kind of one thing that we're, think is valuable is focusing in on this area of the maximum slope here in this relationship. So if we can focus work at or upstream of this area where you have this precipitous temperature increase and this really steep drop in fish abundance, that can be an area where you can get a really rapid response in terms of fish abundance, because you have them there, they're present upstream, they probably were present downstream until temperatures got too high. So they're in that area, they could really benefit from just minor reductions in temperature. And really, we can look at the difference in a couple of years here. If you can kind of prune off the top peak here, you can shift the temperature back to the left a little bit and increase the proportion of sites with steelhead or Chinook, and then have an effect on your population scale productivity. And so just an example of how this can play out across multiple years on the landscape. These are estimated total densities of juvenile steelhead in lower Cottonwood Creek. Cottonwood Creek, the tributary, so it's Cottonwood / Fox Creek, tributary to the lower North Fork John Day. And you can see there's fish present in 2018, 2019, 2020, but the reach we sample there is basically right at this inflection point here on the temperature profile. And so 2021, as Steph mentioned, really hot year. The heat dome comes in and settles down, on the Northwest in June. And then we saw 0 steelhead present in that year. 22, we're back to slightly, some fish are there, but it's definitely in sort of the red zone on our schematic map. So really we think that focusing in on these areas and trying to improve temperature and flow in those areas can be the greatest immediate benefit to steelhead and salmon productivity. And so, what we're really, these are tributary basins. So yes, there can be, AOP projects or needs, but we would like to see those AOP projects combined with habitat, right? Because if you provide passage into an area that's 24C, for instance, that's not moving the needle for fish recovery. But if you do passage with habitat improvements that can potentially move that temperature slightly back to the left, then those are, the synergistic combination of those two things has really potential value for steelhead and salmon. And so as a broader scale thought concept here, I think, one thing we also want to throw out there is that in the idea of optimizing restoration effort, I think we really need to expand our thinking about what is considered an aquatic organism passage project, and maybe just get a conversation started about how AOP funding can be spent, right? Because, we have the classic situation of a irrigation diversion dam or a culvert or a hydro dam or whatever the passage barrier is. So that's pretty clear cut. But then, more and more across the landscape now, we're encountering these situations where the barrier is temperature or desiccation. And, I think we can argue with the data that that's also an AOP passage issue, and also in theory should be worthy of AOP dollars. Because if you have these disconnected or too warm stream sections, we're limiting passage and distribution of native fishes and other aquatic organisms across the landscape. And that's something that we really would hope to focus on with the AOP habitat effort combined. There you go. That's how we fix it right there. Beavers and beaver dam analogs and trees. So yeah, at this point, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Steph. I may have even gone over a couple of slides, but turn it back to Steph.
Yeah, I was supposed to do those other ones, but no big deal. I'm glad.
I was having so much fun.
I know. I don't mind at all. This one was just one that was just a really good visual for me. I was meeting with Grant SWCD, and they were talking about a potential project in Fox Creek. And this was imagery taken in 2012 in September. And if you go to the next slide, please, Ian. Well, as you can see, so this was, the red line represents a habitat restoration that was conducted by the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs. I believe Grant SWCD was involved as well. I don't remember the exact details. I'm sure Steph Kelly would be able to tell us the exact funding sources and all that stuff. But the visual here is that, as you can see in the previous slide, same time frame, but 10 years later, and we have a riparian area upstream of this downstream red line. The upstream of the red line is, obviously in recovery mode. It still remains marginal for suitability for juvenile rearing habitat for salmonids and steelhead. But as you can see, it's pretty fairly obvious that, with an increased floodplain connection and side channel reconnections and habitat work, I mean, it's on a path to recovery. And that's what we're kind of looking for, is these large scale. I mean, just doing it in small batches is great, but really on a larger scale, watershed scale focus, this would be a return to Fox Creek on the upward swing in terms of suitable habitat for juvenile rearing for our steelhead. And that's really kind of, I don't really know how to say it other than look at the picture. It seems like it's pretty obvious that downstream it's very channelized and super incised, and there's very little water and suitable habitat. Upstream, it's on the path to recovery. And that's kind of really what we're trying to really focus on, is this sort of larger scale, broad restoration. And it's not just beaver dam analogs. I mean, we talked a lot about beaver dam analogs. There's other tools in the toolbox. Beaver dam analogs are not suitable for every single site. And as well as filling in your channel, reconnecting alcoves, side channels, building new floodplains, reconnecting them through removal of berms, and establishing riparian vegetation community. These are all tools in the toolbox that help take us from these incised, over-widened, dry, desiccated streams in the summer to a path of recovery where we will see a benefited use by steelhead juvenile rearing habitat created from this. So with that, Adrienne's next, and she will talk a little bit more about our beaver subgroup and the habitat division.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present and for passing the baton, Steph. I'm just going to provide a super high-level quick overview of the Beaver Habitat Action Plan that ODFW has been working on since September of 2022. Next slide, please. And just to provide some context, increasing beaver modified floodplain and riparian habitats has been a priority for ODFW for numerous years and memorialized in many of our documents, including our salmon and steelhead conservation and recovery plans that we have adopted across the state, including our mid-sea steelhead recovery plan for the John Day Basin, and our Pacific lampreys fish plan also identifies beaver habitats as being an important restoration tool in our toolbox. Our Oregon conservation strategy also identifies the importance of beaver for flowing water and wetland and aspen woodland conservation habitats. And most recently in May of 2022, Oregon's Fish and Wildlife Commission Beaver Management Work Group elevated again the importance of increasing beaver modified floodplain habitats at the landscape scale in Oregon. Next slide, please. So we formed an interdivisional team of the Director's Office, Habitat Division, Wildlife Division, Fish Division, East and West Region leadership to start rolling up our sleeves and working on a plan to prioritize our work for the next several years. This just gives you a timeline to show that this is a work in progress, but we're marching towards having the plan rolled out to our Commission's Beaver Management Working Group in March, and sharing that more broadly internally and externally, with final presentation to our Fish and Wildlife Commission in June. Next slide. So our goal is to identify priority actions that the department will undertake to accelerate the restoration of beaver modified habitat at the landscape scale in Oregon. And this goal is to increase critical floodplain, riparian, and aquatic habitat connectivity, and to build resiliency for Oregon's native fish and wildlife populations in the face of climate change. Next slide. And to achieve this goal, our Beaver Habitat Action Plan is structured as 4 integrated pillars of priority action. To focus our work over the next 36 months, devote staff and capacity and resources and time to dig in and really advance this work in our agency and across our programs. And because of today's discussion, just to loop it back to what we've been talking, what Steph and Ian have been presenting on, I'm just going to focus on the habitat restoration pillar. Next slide, please. And so pillar 2, habitat restoration, our goal here for the agency is to advance, prioritize beaver and beaver modified habitat restoration in Oregon by working with our staff and also our external partners who are also working on these initiatives and answering the call in charge of many of our funders that are asking us and requiring us to advance habitat connectivity for our listed and sensitive species on the landscape. And we're taking a 2-prong approach with this. This is restoring habitat for beaver, and these are the habitats that beaver need to be successful on the landscape. Flow permanence, early seral stage riparian cover, longitudinal and lateral riparian connectivity and complexity to support their colony through time. But that also includes beaver modified habitat restoration. All those benefits, Ballas has pointed out here in this graphic, of having beaver on the landscape, doing the hard work for us and creating habitat complexity and connectivity for our steelhead and Chinook populations, for example, in the John Day. And let's see, next slide, covered everything there. And to borrow a thought and a note from Janine Castro, this is about, we're doing succession planning here, right? When we talk about connecting systems that have been altered for a very long time and trying to make them resilient in the face of climate change. And that's through taking this systems approach, is like Ian and Steph have been talking about earlier in this presentation, you know, we really need to dive in, roll up our sleeves, look holistically at our landscape and start addressing those primary species limiting factors, flow, temperature, and how they create barriers to recovery for our species on the landscape. And so we can do this through beaver habitat and beaver modified habitat restoration approaches. While keeping our eyes wide open, bringing effectiveness restoration tools in our toolbox, as Nick mentioned earlier, to make sure that we're monitoring the work that we're doing, how we're achieving our ecological benchmarks through time, and making the adjustments necessary to improve these landscapes and build in that resiliency long term. And next slide. And I think that John Day is a perfect example of a landscape where we're seeing through the work that our restoration partners and landowners have done, is that we can create real win-wins through these projects by leveraging opportunities through beaver habitat and beaver modified habitat restoration, but also all the other restoration tools in our toolbox that Stephanie and we're talking about that we may need to take, you know, that holistic systems approach to really optimizing benefits, restoration benefits, not only for juvenile steelhead and Chinook, but also finding those mutual win-win benefits that help our landowners also meet their climate change objectives through time. And that is all I had for today, and we can take any questions at this time, if we still have time on the clock.
Oh, we've got plenty of time. We're about 30 minutes ahead of schedule, so we got 30 minutes for questions. But yeah, thank you so much, Steph, Ian, Adrienne, for putting that together. that was really helpful and informative. Yeah, so if you want, you can turn on your video. You can ask a question by raising your hand, or you can type a question into the chat and we'll get to it. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind just raising your hand and we can get to people. Okay, Mark, I see you have your hand up. So if you want, go ahead and unmute, maybe turn on your video if you'd like, and let us know what you have to say.
Okay. Thanks. Both great presentations. Question for Ian and Steph, and then one for Adrienne. The information about population distribution and water temperatures, is that in some kind of a format in that entities can go in and use that data to scope out a project? Or is that something that needs to happen yet with that data?
Yeah, those are, I'm not sure if that's in the AGOL layer yet or not, but that's our intent, is to get it into that layer. Certainly it's available from us. And another thing, one thing that a concept that Bonneville Power is working on that we're contributing to is a tool called the fish density analysis tool, which would then show predictions of, because we can only sample a small fraction of the habitat. And so that tool would show predictions for the unsampled area. And we're trying to contribute to calibration and validation of that through our sampling. So as that tool, there's some beta versions of that available right now, Mark, but as that becomes kind of more fleshed out and better vetted, then that will be a tool that I think would answer your question as well.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great if we had a tool to where we could go, if somebody brings us a project and we could go look, okay, does this fit in those zones that are the highest priority, and if not, why? And so in the short term, we could just ask you and Steph to take a look at a particular project to see how it falls within that data.
Sure, yeah, that'd be the most direct route until we get that FDAT tool, fully functional.
And some of it might be a request for Brent and I, or Ian and his research folks and his research crew, to potentially go out and do a little bit of sampling. Like, we don't have juvenile population data for every single tributary in the John Day Basin, but it doesn't mean that we can't spend a day or two doing some e-shocking or a mark recap study. It doesn't take that much time. We can potentially, if it's a proposed project that would meet a lot of our ecological uplift values, we could spend some time figuring out if there's really any steelhead juveniles using that area, or to what extent in that tributary. So it's not like if we don't have the information, we can't get to it. It just would take a little bit of advance warning and planning with us. But we're more than willing to help out, because if we're asking for you to focus on these types of projects in these areas, and we don't have the answer for every single tributary, we will work towards getting that for you.
Great, that's really helpful. And then to Adrienne, on the beaver habitat work, has there been any effort to look at the regulatory permitting process, trying to streamline those processes so that more of that work can get done on the ground in a timely manner at least cost, instead of the large amount of permitting and other stuff that has to happen?
So I will say this has definitely been a topic of discussion internally that's been elevated. We know that restoration practitioners are dealing with this, and that it's getting more burdensome, right? And so we have our eyes on this. As we understand it, there's some federal programs that could use some streamlining. And if I'm not talking out of school, there are some groups external to ODFW that are looking at that streamlining process. I believe it's the Beaver Institute, which is a national group. a national beaver restoration group that's looking at permitting across the Pacific Northwest and other states, but really hoping to work with others to unstick that issue and find streamlined pathways. So
Great.
it's a work in progress. That's a short answer.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Mark, for those questions. Ken, go ahead and let us know what your question is.
Can you guys hear me all right? Okay.
Yes.
One thing that I've been battling in some of my areas are where I have in streams, ODFW in streams, and other stuff that I have to protect downstream, but the beaver dams are keeping me from ferrying the water down to them. Do you guys have a way forward, or do you think that holistically this will all improve enough to where that's not going to be an issue later? I just wanted to kind of bend your ear about that. And since we're talking about the beaver habitat, specifically, I'm looking at Bridge Creek, and it is lined with analogs and real beaver dams. And it's very difficult for me to regulate water and get it to the users downstream, even if it's an in-stream. So some of these in-streams aren't being met because of these beaver dams or the beaver dam analogs. And I just want to know how would you see a priority list for me? Is it more important to have the in-stream water going downstream, or is it more important to have the beavers left alone?
So I'll tackle part of this. What I'm picturing is that, you know, upstream by the town of Mitchell, you have beaver dam complexes that hold water. And then downstream, you have landowners that looking at that and going, we don't have enough water down here, but there's plenty of water backed up behind those beaver dams. Well, my simple, quick and dirty solution would be create the habitat that backs up the water to provide it for you as a landowner downstream, instead of targeting the upstream areas where there is actual water and habitat, you know, as a result of the beaver dams, rather than kicking those down and flushing the water downstream. That's a very short-term solution.
I understand.
Yeah, the long-term solution, in my opinion, for the scenario that you're painting is fix the riparian area and increase your water latency, and, you know, fix the desiccation problem in the reach where the landowners are asking for more water. It obviously seems to be working pretty well above. I mean, you go above those beaver dam analogs, you know, up towards the town of Mitchell, and it's pretty much dry. But you go to these beaver dams, and that's where your water is. Kicking them down and releasing the water isn't going to help fish, nor is it going to help the landowner, really. It's a very short-term solution for a problem that, in my opinion, would be start addressing the habitat in your reach where you feel like you need the water and you're drying it out. I mean, that's the quick and dirty answer, I guess, to that one.
So look for losing reaches. Look for losing reaches where we can make some benefit on putting them in.
I mean, obviously, if they're working and they're providing water and habitat, I mean, would it be safe to say that below that, where your water users are needing the water, there is very little habitat, very little beaver dams? I mean, that's kind of part of the problem. I mean, it's also an issue that they're sucking the water out, right? Like, I mean, that's not necessarily conducive to long-term survival when we have these record droughts and low water. I mean, we're faced with a pretty daunting climactic shift in the John Day Basin, and everyone needs water. I don't know if necessarily targeting these structures that is holding water and impounding water and providing habitat and rearing for juveniles is necessarily, you know, a bad thing. I don't see that as a bad thing. And I know that landowners are looking at it potentially of like, well, that's where my water is. But if you tear those down, or if they weren't there in existence, then you're just flushing that water. It's a very short-term solution to provide water, whereas I feel like the long-term solution would be a more holistic and broader approach to mimicking some of that restoration that's obviously working.
So the priority is just leave the beavers alone.
Yeah, that would be my opinion. Adrienne, Ian?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ken. I mean, I guess, so if you have an in-stream water right at a point that's further downstream into like that red zone, in theory, this gets into a lot of complicated legal and policy. That's all Steph's Steph's realm. But in theory, from a pure fish perspective, maintaining the water in an area that's a yellow or green zone, which in the Bridge Creek example, that's yellow or green zone for fish abundance. In the Bridge Creek example, that's the area from Painted Hills upstream. So maintaining water in that area would be more valuable for fish than trying to meet an in-stream water right target at the mouth of Bridge Creek.
It could be an opportunity to, Ian and Steph are familiar with this, and you might be, Ken, as well, is, one of our key messages today is, there's several tools we should put in our toolbox, right? And not just use one. 15 Mile Creek in over towards the Hood Basin has a voluntary conservation in-stream water payment program. Something like that could also be something we look at putting in the toolbox for John Day. We've explored that a little bit on Cottonwood Creek, at least getting the pre-project monitoring work done for that. So that's a place where we can look at like all the tools in our toolbox and say, well, instead of ripping out the beaver dams, like Ian and Steph said, that are providing habitat benefits for listed species during critical drought periods, what else is in our toolbox to help with this scenario? In addition to habitat restoration, are there other tools we need to put on the table or consider that have worked other places that might also work for the John Day as we're getting hotter and drier? And
I do have a question. Have you guys targeted the springs, the top springs of that are usually what defines the channel down below and some of the drier reaches, and maybe asked for fencing around those and some tree plantings to try to kind of establish a safe spot and a cool spot for all the water to start coming down, and then systematically just putting trees down along the edge to try to help?
I mean, we're always interested in working with partners and implementing those types of projects. It's a matter of, are there willing landowners, Forest Service, BLM, they have priorities and they're working on things as well. It's not that we don't want to, it's just a matter of like, have those chips fallen into place yet? So, I mean, difficult question to answer, but I mean, would we want to do that? Yes, absolutely.
So if I brought you those projects, you guys would have some funding. Is there a person I can talk with about that, or should I just talk with you?
You're talking with the group that is pretty much in charge of doing a lot of the restoration work in the John Day Basin. There's over 50 people on here, and I'm sure we can get some raised hands of folks that want to tackle a partnership and coordinated effort to do restoration. There's no doubt about that.
I think that would help in some, at least in a lot of the dry tribs that head north off the John, or head south to the John Day. I think that would help in some areas. So thank you for all the good information. That's all I had. Thank you.
Yeah, we got some things going on in the chat too. Just want to make sure everyone sees that. Lindsay noted that federal agencies, so U.S. Forest Service and BLM specifically, now have additional programmatic coverage for permits that will cover BDAs, and that's new in 2022, and this will help streamline those requirements. And then Karen asked if maybe OWEB small landowner grants could help with this. Yes, so some ideas flow in there. Brian does have his hand up, so yeah, what's your question, Brian?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for a great presentation, Stephanie and Adrienne. That was a lot of information in an understandable way in a short time, so well done. My question is for Adrienne, and it involves the relationship between beaver dam analogs and beaver restoration. I saw in the graphic an indication that that if you install beaver dam analogs, you may then encourage beavers to recolonize on their own, as it looked like. This is a question that I've gotten from people about beaver dam analogs. My sense is that actual if you get beaver in there building their own dams and flooding and restoring the floodplain, et cetera, that is a preferable or higher quality result, basically, compared to a BDA. Beaver, my understanding is they're complicated. They're not always welcome by all landowners. That is what it is. But anyway, if you could address, I also understand that to actually have a sustainable population of beaver, you need to have the habitat for them in place. You need to have the food source, the hardwood trees and shrubs that they can chew down, but you have to have those established to a high enough level to where the beaver just don't eat themselves out of a habitat. So anyway, if you could address that relationship between creating beaver dam analogs and how that potentially affects recolonization by beaver, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.
I will try my best, noting that I'm really a fish head who's an acting interdivisional beaver coordinator. So I will try my best because I'm learning a lot through the beaver team assignment. So I think we can confidently say that we get you can have a higher likelihood of seeing beaver at a BDA sites if they were already active in an area. So if you have a subwatershed area where you've documented beaver activity and beaver sign and beaver presence already, and you're just building out from their current structures and their current activity, then you're probably likely to see good colonization from them. They're, like you mentioned, they are drawn to very specific habitat types. They need flow permanence in terms of, having cover, because they are tasty snacks for cougars and other wildlife. And so they're going to look at, those Goldilocks spots on the landscape where they have all of the things that they need, like all species, shelter, food, and good flowing water where they can have their lodges and catches and food supply and be protected. And so I think when you're in those Goldilocks spots of building your BDAs, you will naturally see them there. But there could be some areas on the landscape where they may not, where you're creating BDAs, but you're right, the habitat isn't suitable for a colony to establish and occupy a site over time. And that's a place where we would focus our efforts to working with the wildlife side of our house and the habitat side of our house to think about if that is your goal, is to build BDAs, but also have beaver manage them, get some free labor out of nature's engineers. Thinking about site planning in terms of doing those pre-project surveys to see if beaver are active in the area, have the habitat requirements there to successfully move into the temporary condos you might be building for them. So those are just some things to think about, but we have tools in the toolbox for that too. And we have great knowledge base in our wildlife staff, not only our wildlife district bios in the John Day Basin, but also Derek Broman, our fur bearer carnivore coordinator, can help with this effort. And then also a good protocol that I like to share with folks is Vanessa Petro, who was at OSU, who's now at ODF. hat tip to our new partner on the partnership. But one of their staff, who's a wildlife biologist, has designed a beaver activity protocol that is also in Survey 123 format. So if folks are kind of looking for those tools to do those surveys, get in touch with our wildlife staff, contact Derek, contact Vanessa, and we can help with some of that boots on the ground work. So I might have gone on a tangent there. Did that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Adrienne. We have another question from Alexander Reeder. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll introduce myself. I'm Alexander Reeder, and I'm out here at the Cherry Creek with the Wildlands Conservancy. Pretty new project beginning as we transition from a ranch and more, it's now under the Conservancy's hands. So just excited to be here. I just got the notification about this today. And it was great to learn a lot more of the same questions I've been trying to research about beavers and fish habitat. And so I guess I just have one quick question along the same lines. What about protecting some of the cottonwoods or trees that already exist? Are there surefire tools that are working, like using flashing or some wire to just protect some of those cottonwoods? And then I know as we get other habitat and other trees growing, or do you have an opinion on that? Just letting the beavers chew down a tree?
Yeah, just as a quick aside, I definitely understand the frustration. When I worked for the tribes in the Middle Fork many years ago, we had caged off our aspens and cottonwoods that we planted, and within 6 or 7 years of caging them, they were 20 feet tall, they were huge basal diameter, they were looking great, and we took off some of the cages, and within 12 hours beavers knocked them down. So I mean, we are consistently faced with the good and the bad of beaver restoration. We want beavers, we want them to build their dams, we want the habitat, but they can be an issue with our, especially cottonwood galleries and aspens. They're candy to them. Which are tree species that we definitely want to encourage in our riparian area. So my suggestion would be caging them, and caging them for a long time, because as soon as you take off those cages, they better be much bigger than like a basal diameter of that, because that's just candy for beavers. Adrienne can talk more about specific habitat.
Some of the coexistence tools I've also seen is paint. The word is escape. It's basically horticulture paint, I guess, that you put grit in, sand in, and you can paint the trunks. And no one likes to nibble on gritty things, including beavers. And so that is one tool I've seen in some of the coexistence documents of, especially for because they'll go after landscaping, they'll go after, restoration project trees, and it can be an effective way to protect the plants in addition to caging, because sometimes they can be quite crafty. I know at one of my husband's research sites in Starkey, vegetation falls down and they can use it as a ramp to get into your cage, and then nibble down the tree, they will. So there's definitely some good strategies out there. You can Google like landscaping, beaver coexistence, landscaping treatments, and that might give you some tools as well.
Thank you. Those are all great. So thanks. I'll hopefully be back for the next meeting, and then I can have more questions for the Cherry Creek specifically. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And definitely let Hannah and me know if you want to be on that email list. We'll get you added. And then just want to note some things happening in the chat. Where is that? Rebecca Viray mentioned that USACE is starting to update their 2013 slopes programmatics, and it should include BDAs in the next revision. And then we also have Sue asking about a high elevation beaver restoration. We don't know what the A stands for tool. And then Hannah put the link into that for the John Day Basin. So hopefully some good resources there. Do we have any more questions, just in case anyone couldn't figure out the raise your hand functions? If anybody wants to unmute now and just ask your question, feel free. If not, we're doing pretty good on schedule now. So yeah, just give it a second. Okay. Think we covered all the questions. Thank you so much, Steph, Ian, Adrienne. That was really helpful. Thanks for putting that presentation together and answering all our questions. Lots of applause from our participants. So yeah, great.